Hey everybody, this is Dust for Dusted on Gaming with an update on our treasure chest hunt for October with Burn. We're now up to 17 treasure chests. I went 5-0 in my most recent league, entirely off camera so far. If you guys want me to, I can do a replay of it, but this is more of a someone requested a look at the spreadsheet and kind of a sideboarding guide. So this is kind of more of that. This league was a little weird. We played against Counters Company, Zoo, Mono White, Death and Taxes, sort of. Was playing Apocryphite in the deck, as well as things like Hero of Bladehold. Then we played against Mill, and then we played against Blue Red Thing, which was actually probably the closest matchup of the five. We did drop games to Counters Company and to Mono White Death and Taxes because game one they had a really weird draw and they had a lot of hate cards. I mean, the hate cards for Burn's definitely on the rise. The Mono White Death and Taxes player had access to Worship, Burrington Forge Tender, and Auric Champion in the post-board games. The Mill player, kind of hard to really tell what they have, because Mill's generally a pretty good matchup for Burn, as long as you can avoid cracking fetch lands, and I got pretty lucky in that matchup not to have to crack fetch lands. And the Blue-Red Thing matchup is always close, especially if they get an early thing in the ice down. They can put a lot of pressure on you to when they flip the thing, and they can close the game really quickly, which is probably one of Control's bigger issues against some of these more aggressive decks is sometimes closing the game quickly enough. Things like Blue-Red Thing and things like Geist of St. Trap can do a really good job of closing the door against Burn. So far that's 4 leagues. I'm going to pull up the Excel spreadsheet now. Nothing too fancy. So far, these are the matchups we've all played against so far. Now, these are only friendly leagues. We haven't played against anything in the competitive leagues yet. So far we've played against 18 different decks. 19 different decks. I think the only repetitive one was Dredge so far, which Dredge seems to be on a bit of an uptick. It's really kind of hard to say what's going on with Modern too terribly much because, you know, a lot of the top Modern players, they're working on standard decks right now. So there isn't quite as much like really hardcore trying to develop in Modern. And I am playing in the friendly leagues, which it seems we're playing a lot wider variety of decks than the top tier decks. Of course, I haven't played competitive leagues with Burn in a while, so maybe we'll have to give that a spin here before too terribly long. So this is the look at what we've played against so far. Blue-Red Drakes, that's thanks to Sovereign Olive. Green-Black Ponza was whatever. Jun can be a tough matchup, especially since they don't do a lot of damage themselves. Green-White Wamp was a weird one. Dredge feels a lot closer than it even used to, with the addition of Creeping Shield, the two different Eldrazi the different taxes lists. Generally, they're a little bit favorable for Burn. But generally they also have a lot of sideboard cards for the matchup, so the matchup can get a little bit swingy. Bogles is a miserable matchup, although I did manage to make some interesting games of it. Merfolk, I consider most of the creature decks probably slightly favorable for my build of Burn. I'll get into that in the sideboarding guide. Storm's generally a pretty good matchup for us. Blue Tron's generally a pretty good matchup. Slivers, they're able to kind of counteract a little bit what we're doing with the Fusion Sliver. Blue-Black Fairies, Bug Control, Green-White Death and Taxes we lost to. So we've run into like 3 different Death and Taxes variants. The Green-White also had Night of Autumn, which is a pretty nice new addition. And then Counters Company, deck that I have a lot of experience playing from its heyday, last summer. Naya Zoo, they're trying to do a lot of the same things we do. We're doing a little bit less damage to ourselves. We're a little less creature base. So as long as you can answer their creatures, they're pretty good. Mill's trying to do what Burn's trying to do, but in a different way. It takes a little bit slower. And Blue-Red Thing is probably one of the tougher control matchups, at least in my experience. Alright, so anywho, on to kind of the sideboard guide, kind of just a general discussion about my particular build of Burn, at least in my experience. So let's take a look at the meta according to MTG Goldfish right now. So Burn is kind of crept up to the top, which is kind of weird to me. Blue-white control, humans, Tron, spirits, hardened scales, Jund, Hollow One, Jessica control, Grixis Death Shadow, Martyr Pyromancer, Storm, Vengevine, blue-red thing, Dredge. I definitely have seen Dredge on the uptick. If you look at the classics of lately, Amulet Titan's been kind of doing the thing. A couple of Burn decks here. Amulet Titan can definitely be a tough matchup for Burn, but there aren't too many people playing it. That may change as it continues to put up results, but it's a really tough deck to learn. The challenge here, a couple Dredge decks at the top here, Hollow One, Dredge. So a lot of graveyard-based decks, at least a couple weekends ago. And then, so that's pretty much what's going on. So I'm going to break the sideboarding down into a couple different blocks. So I kind of look at Modern as there are other aggressive decks, combo decks, control decks, and mid-range decks. So they each take like a little bit different strategy as to what you're tweaking, what you're taking out, what you're bringing in. So the first deck is, I guess we could start with the Burn Mirror. So the Burn Mirror, generally speaking, if Burn's prevalent in your area, you want core Firewalkers in your sideboard. That is kind of the mirror breaker. The only true answers to it are either Path to Exile, having your own core Firewalker, or being able to trick your opponent into blocking with core Firewalker with a Skullcrack effect. So those are basically the only ways to deal with it in the mirror match, and with both players casting a lot of red spells, that's a lot of life gain. As far as the mirror match with my version that doesn't currently have the core Firewalkers, the cards I like in the mirror match, and it kind of depends, like the cards I generally look to cut are these Eidolons, especially on the draw, but I even tend to like them to cut them on the play. I don't like matchups with Eidolon in which I draw it and I can be very far behind. We'll get into another set of matchups where I almost always board out Eidolon, but a lot of times in the Burn Mirror, I just board this out completely, especially on the draw, but sometimes even on the play, I don't bring it back in. It's just, this card is very good when you're able to push ahead, but when you're drawing it in a late game and you're behind on stuff, it can be a very miserable card. So in certain matchups where I'm likely to fall behind or have a risk of taking more damage, this isn't a card that I'm too apt to keep in. So the biggest dance with the Burn Mirror is you generally want some number of Path to Exile, sometimes 2, sometimes 4. In the post-board games, I'll probably usually bring in like 2 Path, 2 Searing Blood. Now the problem with this sideboarding plan is this is against creatures. And a lot of times, people will board out Eidolons. Sometimes people even board out the 1-drops. So sometimes these Searing effects can actually get stuck in your hand, and I've actually lost some Burn Mirrors in those cases. But the only other thing you can really do is bring in Exquisitive Firecraft in this build, and Firecraft's not really where you want to be in the Burn Mirror, because the Burn Mirror usually comes down to like play your creatures the first couple turns, either decide if you're trying to race or if you're playing the controlling role. And if you're playing control role, you just try to kill your opponent's creatures and then try to Lightning Helix and core Firewalker your way to victory. So usually the sideboarding plan with Burn is 4 Eidolon out, some number of Path, and some number of Searing effects in. And sometimes you'll bring the Eidolons back into the play. It's honestly a matter of personal preference. There's a lot of matchups I just leave Eidolon in, but that's certainly a matchup in which you can take it out and not feel too terribly bad. The second group of decks is the other aggressive decks, and I kind of break those down into really 2 variants. But in the end, your goal is kind of the same. It's just a matter of what cards you kind of board out, what cards you kind of board in. Against the subset of decks that I refer to as the Ether Vial decks. Humans, spirits, merfolk. I guess you could even throw slivers into that mix. I generally like to board out Eidolon. Because you get into a situation where if they have... Now, granted, if they don't have Ether Vial, which they won't in 40 or 50% of their games, but in the situations where they have Ether Vial on one or two, Eidolon becomes a real liability. So I generally in those matchups like to kind of play a pseudo control role. So when you're playing the pseudo control role, you often want to take out your cards that don't interact with creatures. So the subset of cards that don't interact with creatures are Lava Spikes, Skull Cracks, Boros Charms, and Eidolon themselves. Like in the Ether Vial matchups, I will board out Eidolon and then board out either Spike or Boros Charm or Skull Crack, depending on what my opponents have. Against humans, any white-based deck, you cannot afford to board out Skull Crack usually, because they usually have some type of hate card for burn, be it Auriok Champion, be it Core Firewalker, be it some type of incidental life gain, like Lightning Helix out of Jeskai decks, etc. So generally, I don't like to board out the Skull Cracks. I usually board out either Boros Charm or Lava Spike, and the package I usually bring in those situations is the Searing Effects and the 4 Path to Exile. Because you want... The way you win the game is getting creatures down and pressuring them, or controlling the game long enough to draw a bunch of burn spells and kill them. And you want to be able to answer their big creatures, their creatures that get outside of 3 toughness range, like the humans decks, or the spirits decks can even do that. So you want Path to Exile to answer those cards. You want Path to Exile to answer things like Auriok Champion. Grim Lavamancer is often your better weapons in those matchups. A lot of times, players won't even mainboard these in creature heavy metas. And there's certainly been times where Humans has been one of the popular decks that I've main decked a couple Grim Lavamancers and put a few Skull Cracks in the sideboard. And that's perfectly fine. But it's mainly your personal preference. Do you board out Boros Charm? Do you board out Skull Crack? Or do you board out Spike? Skull Crack you generally leave in situations where you're fearing incidental life gain. Lava Spike you board out in situations where you want the pass to kind of leverage your early creatures. Boros Charm has some utility. I mean, it has the double strike. It has the make your permanents indestructible. So there are certain situations where Boros Charm is certainly a card you want to consider. The other subset of aggro decks, things like Affinity, things like I'm trying to think what other aggro decks there are at this point. Basically decks like Affinity and such, you generally don't board out the Lavamancer or the Eidolons, and then you still board in like these 8 cards, and if you're up against Affinity or Hardened Scales, you bring in the 3 Wear Tears too. And then once again, the cards you're boarding out are usually like Lava Spikes, Boros Charms, basically the things that don't interact with creatures. In some situations, you might even board out some of your 1-drop creatures, especially on the draw. You don't think they're going to get in for any significant damage. Usually Goblin Guide over Swift Spear, but that's usually how you handle those decks. Another subset of decks is control decks. Blue-white control, Jeskai control, blue-black Fae, usually the blue-based counterspell decks. So there's a couple of things you have to keep in mind with those decks. Are they going to have creatures post-board, and how many answers what type of creatures are they, and how many answers do you want? Like the blue-red decks have Thing in the Ice. So against Thing in the Ice, you usually want to bring in a couple of Path to Exile and the Exquisitive Firecrafts. That's the main reason the Exquisitive Firecrafts are on the sideboard, is for the counterspell-based matchups. Usually the only thing I board out in those matchups is usually the 4 Searing Blazes, usually bring in some amount of either Pass or Firecrafts against blue-red decks. Against blue-red decks that you see Blood Moon out of, you also want to board down on some amount of your white spells. So you'll bring in like your it's not the greatest, but you'll bring in like your Lavamancers, your Firecrafts, and even maybe your Searing Bloods if they have Snapcaster Mages and such, just to avoid the number of spells getting trapped in your hand against Blood Moon. Against Jeskai, I'll bring in the Firecrafts, and sometimes I'll have to leave in Searing Blazes, because I love bringing in Lavamancer against blue-white control specifically. Against blue-white, I'm bringing in these 4 cards, and boarding out my Searing Blazes. Against Jeskai, Lavamancer's not that great, so I usually bring in the 2 Firecrafts, and usually leave, either bring in 2 paths to try to answer like Angels if you're fearing that, or bring in the 2 Firecrafts, and then just leave in 2 Searing Blazes, because they usually have to play Snapcaster Mage at some point, or a Vendilion Click. So a couple of Blaze effects aren't terrible, but I would prefer to have cards to board out in those situations. Fey's a little bit different. You can bring in the Searing Bloods and the Firecrafts, and you usually board out like Skullcracks, because their main form of life gain is Collective Brutality, and a lot of times you don't have, you don't want to be holding up Skullcrack, and you're not able to hold up Skullcrack in those situations, because you're trying to play around their counter spells, and they can sometimes have Kalitas, so sometimes pass necessary. I guess what I'm trying to say in this sideboarding guide is, understand what cards you want to bring out and what cards you want to bring in and why. A lot of it's trial and error, a lot of it's preference of what's in your sideboard. It's kind of hard to give a true sideboard guide in the situations where your opponent can have different cards. Like your opponent has Leyline of Sanctity, you gotta bring in different cards against the opponent. Or bringing in like Blessed Alliance and Lightning Helix. You gotta pay attention to what your opponent has and try to bring in the correct cards to play around those strategies. Another subset of decks is decks like Tron. Usually with Tron, you board out the 4 Blazes. I usually bring in 2 Path and 2 Wear Tear, simply to answer things like Wormcoil Engine, and leave the Skullcracks in to try to mitigate things like Thragtusk and Wormcoil Engine. Hardened Scales, I kind of already went over. You bring in all 11 cards and board out some number of Lava Spikes, maybe Skullcracks, and depends on what you've seen. If you see Basilisk Caller, you want to leave in Skullcrack, just different things. The Hardened Scales matchup's been a lot tougher than the traditional Affinity matchups, but I've only played it a couple times, so I don't have enough data on that. The mid-range pile decks like Jund, decks like Black-Green, decks like Pyromancer, all require a little bit different finesse. Jund, you generally want to bring in some number of paths to answer things like Tarmogoyf and Scavenging Ooze, and you generally board down on the Searing effects usually, because they don't always reliably kill. Usually it's some number of paths for some number of Blaze effects. The Jund matchup hasn't felt great. I don't know if it's... the matchup feels close, just hasn't felt great the last couple times I've played it. Pyromancer doesn't put quite as much pressure on you with Young Pyromancer and Bedlam Reveler until a little bit later in the game, but they do have Blood Moon, so you want to try to board out some amount of your Boros Charms and Lightning Helixes, and usually in that case you bring in these 6 cards to try to mitigate that, or these 4, and then leave in some number of either Helixes or Boros Charms. You really don't want to bring in Path to fight against Red Lure. That's kind of a losing battle, because once they start casting Revelers, they usually chain them. Trying to think what other decks. Against the Graveyard decks, Hollow One, Dredge, those kind of things, you're kind of... the Hollow One matchup, you want to bring in Path to Exiles and Rest in Pieces. And then I usually go down some number of Skull Cracks and some number of Eidolon, or some number of like Lava Spike or Boros Charm, the cards that don't directly impact their big idiots. As long as they're truly busted draws, you're very rarely going to beat. Their normal 50 to 60% of their decks, you can usually compete with. And their terrible draws, they look like a pile of cards that shouldn't belong, and you should usually beat them as long as you haven't mulliganed. Rest in Peace is not great on the draw, but it's a card that helps shut down some of their engines. It shuts down the Delve threats if they can't cast them in the first couple turns. It shuts down the recursion of things like things like Bloodghast and Phoenix, which can be relevant, and allows you to just kind of, once you've answered their creatures, they're gone, and then you can just kill them with your burn spells. Dredge is a little bit weird because of the advent of Creeping Chill and Conflagrate. So that's a matchup where I used to bring out, usually leave in some Nurse Skull Cracks for Gnaw to the Bone, but now they have Creeping Chill, they're Hate's main deck. So that matchup, I usually bring in a couple Rest in Pieces, and I might board in Searing Bloods for some of their guys. Because what you need to try to do in those matchups is you need to try to get in a couple chip shot hits with your 1-drops, and then just kind of hope your burn spells can kill them before their various beats of prized amalgams and such beat you down. Sometimes in those matchups I'll board out Eidolon, because after the first turn or two, unless they're on the Loam Conflagrate plan, they don't actually cast that many spells, and Eidolon can actually be a bit of a detriment, especially on the draw. So sometimes you board out Eidolon, sometimes you board out things like Lava Spikes or Boros Charms, but you definitely do need some reach in those matchups, because that matchup is kind of about speed, but they can definitely grind too. That's pretty much... Oh, the combo. I guess we'll go over the combo decks as kind of the last kind of big block of decks. The combo matchups, your key card is Eidolon, the Great Rebel. Things against KCI, Storm, those kind of decks. Usually what you want to do in those matchups is get your threats down, and get your 1-drops down, get your Eidolon into play, and then hold up your spells to react, because they both have key cards. KCI has Scrap Troller. The Storm decks usually need a mana dork and one of their dorks in play. Those are the kind of decks you kind of react to. If you're on the draw against Storm, there are times you just can't tap out. You literally have to hold up interaction from turn 2 on, and then hope you have a bolt. I like to board in Paths and to have another 1-mana interaction. Against Storm, I'll usually board out Lava Spikes and Skull Cracks, and board in 4 Paths and 2 Rest in Peace, because I want to have as much, especially on the draw, I want to have as much 1-mana interaction, so I can play as many spells on my main phase and still hold up interaction for their mana dorks. Against KCI, it's a little bit trickier, because if they play KCI before Scrap Troller, usually a pretty good KCI player can play around any type of interaction you might have, and Eidolon's really the only threat you have against that, and they usually have Nature's Claims and Engineered Explosives to clean it up. So KCI, you just want to try to get them dead. Storm, you can play a little bit more of a control role with holding up bolts and Searing Blazes and that kind of stuff for their idiots. Yeah, Storm's usually a pretty good matchup. KCI is pretty close. I haven't played enough of the matchup to know for sure one way or the other. Another honorable mention deck is Grixis Death Shadow. Part of the reason my deck's developed the way it is was the heyday of Grixis Death Shadow. So usually with GDS, I board out the 4 Blaze effects, and then board in usually 4 Path to Exile and 2 Exquisitive Firecraft. It's the other reason I've left the Firecrafts in my sideboard besides the control decks. And then I board out the 4 Blaze effects, and then 2 copies of If I'm on the draw, sometimes it'll even be the Goblin guides, just because they have like Fatal Pushes, Collective Brutalities, Fasker, Mag Anglers, Fast S Shadows. Usually, with them, you want to hold your spells as long as possible. Unless they're unless they're pressuring you with a delve threat, then you kind of have to, fire your spells off through their Stubborn Denials and such. But usually, Path to Exile forces them to either take a Path to Exile or run out a threat or two in the Stubborn Denials and stuff to try to keep their guys alive. That's why Path's the main thing. If you get their big threats off the table, you have so much more time, and they have to lower their life total anyway. That matchup actually feels pretty good. It's close games, but usually feels pretty good in the post-war games. That's kind of covered just about every general deck. If you have any specific questions about how I sideboard against a specific matchup, if I've played it enough, I will try to give you the best thing that I can. But I wanted to make this more a discussion on my thought process with sideboarding than specific sideboard guides, because I don't think sideboard guides are great. I think understanding the thought process and how to go about sideboarding is something you develop as you play a deck more. But I wanted to give you guys my thoughts and update status on the October challenge, which we're up to 17 treasure chests with our 5-0. So we're getting there. Probably definitely have to play some more leagues, but I got some standard stuff to get to and some homework and such to work on. So was playing a little bit like a match here or there the last couple days when I couldn't be streaming because of school. So this has been Dusted on Gaming. A little bit of a sideboard guide, sideboard thought process, and look at the Excel spreadsheet so far for the October challenge, which we're through 4 leagues and we're 16-4. So can't really complain. That's definitely slightly above to probably well above average with burn, but it's kind of hard to maintain an 8% win percentage for any deck. So this has been Dusk for Dusted on Gaming. Thanks everyone for hanging out and checking us out here on our Sideboarding guide for Modern Boros Burn.